Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. That time of week again. Everybody's favorite segment, the MLB Power Rankings. Guys, a little bit late starting today. The Blue Jays and Seattle decided to go to extra innings and really put on a long game, but I had to watch the end of it. It was really close. It was a really close series. We'll get into that. We're going to go over all 30 teams as per usual, and it was a pretty hard week to do. The bottom row is a little bit crazy. I was really having a tough time deciding what to do. We'll get to that. Top row, a lot of teams having somewhat losing weeks in there. And overall, across the MLB, over the last 10 games, a monster amount of teams are 5-5, making it super difficult to do this ranking system. But I'm here. I'm doing it every week as per usual. And if you are new here, subscribe to the channel. We're on our way. We're growing up big, and it's been super exciting doing these every week as well as other videos. But we're going to jump right into it, and we're going to stick to number 30, even though they had a pretty good week, and you can't really argue with how it went for them. 2-2 against Milwaukee, a 4-game set to start the week off. They had a nice home game set across the week as well, going 2-1 against Kansas City over the weekend. So nice 4-3 week for Colorado Rockies. The reason I'm leaving them there is because they were there last week, and the teams ahead of them have beaten them relatively recently. And really, it's pretty much a wash. Colorado always seems to have that home field advantage, and it does add up to a bit more wins over these other than these other teams tend to have. You see it, for example, in big scoring opportunities that we saw them play against the Brewers, for instance. However, it does go the other way very often, like the Royals today going 10-1 against the Rockies. So it goes both ways, but it is a little bit of an advantage in terms of bottom row and picking up some wins. So I'm still keeping them number 30. I think overall, on the road especially, they are definitely one of the worst teams. Number 29, they are sticking in that spot. We do have the White Sox. They lose both series. They did have the advantage of beating Colorado last week. They lose to Miami over the weekend, which is one of those teams they are chasing in this bottom row. They go 1-2 as well against Cleveland. It's nice to see that they are being somewhat competitive in their own division, not really getting swept too often. They are picking up W's and picking up the odd series win in their division, which I consider to be one of the strongest divisions as well, which has helped be the reason Chicago has been so far down here on this board this season. Number 28, that team, just talking about them, the Miami Marlins. I think this is the first week that Miami didn't get shut out in what feels like 2 months. So they did have that going for them. They beat the White Sox, which helps them stay here. I was even considering putting them in last place. They are really possibly the worst team. Any three of these teams, I would not argue with anyone if they had them as number 30. They started the week off getting swept by the Boston Red Sox, a team that is up in the upper echelon of this MLB. And Miami somehow manages to beat some of these weaker teams. The pitching seems to be there. Offensively, not so much. Number 27, I think I cursed this team. If you watched last week, I talked about how of all the teams in the bottom row, they were possibly on their way of breaking out of 25th. There has been 5 teams in this bottom row constantly all season long. Angels being one of them. They felt like they were starting to be a team that was going to be there. Number 25 had been a tough spot to really pass. Had been one of those teams that's been interchanging all season long, while the bottom 5 has stayed the same. The Angels just had a bad week. They got absolutely smashed by Oakland, 0-3, losing a sweep to Oakland when I had them right next to each other. Did not bowl well. They also lost the series over the weekend, 2-1 against the Chicago Cubs. So a 1-5 week against 2 teams that were in the bottom row last week. That is not how you get out of the bottom row, and that's especially how you start being near the bottom. Are the Angels going to start being part of this bottom 3 teams that I was just talking about? It's very possible if they don't figure out what happened this week. Number 26, we have the Oakland A's, and maybe they're going to start being that team that's like, hey, maybe we can be out of the bottom row. Out of all of these teams that I'm talking about so far, the A's are the one team that has had a smell of the middling rows this season. They, at one point, were sniffing around the playoffs. Of course, it's not really the case right now. They did have that good series against the Angels. Then they play the Baltimore Orioles over the weekend, and we did see them really light up the scoreboard. I think it was 17 runs they scored against the Orioles yesterday. However, they do lose the series. They lose the other 2 games of the series. The Friday night game was super close, 3-2. So the A's on most nights are super competitive. Their bullpen, and we know Miller is a big staple of what's going on there. But other than that, they don't really seem to hold a torch or a candle to any of these teams we're going to talk about, except maybe number 25. I think we do have the same bottom row as last week. However, it's quite a bit shuffled. The Cubs, they go 1-2 against Philly and 2-1 against the Angels, so a 500 week, and they're going to pretty much stay. I think the bottom six is pretty cemented. I did at one point this week consider number 24 in that bottom row, and I still think they are very capable of falling into that bottom row, and that is part of the reason why I had to watch the end of this game. Blue Jays managed to salvage a series win against Seattle. It was an epic playoff kind of series against Seattle, honestly. These two teams have met up recently in playoffs as well, and Seattle has had the best of the Blue Jays. Blue Jays have now won both series against Seattle this year, 2-1, so they do have that advantage right now. The Blue Jays, on the other hand, went 1-3 against Houston, a team that, of course, is one of the hotter teams in the MLB, trying to climb the rankings. They've been super hot. They've always seemed to have the Blue Jays number forever, but at the same time, the Blue Jays have just been absolutely struggling. They just can't seem to get anything going whatsoever. They've tried to bring up some guys to get this offense going, and it seems to be working at times. But when that's going on, their pitching just seems to fall apart. And as of late, their bullpen has been a big issue. They salvaged it in my books. They were flirting with coming into this bottom row. And let's not get ahead of ourselves. They're on a West Coast road trip. We're going to see them play San Fran and Arizona this upcoming week. So it's very possible if we see another ugly week, could possibly be 3 ugly weeks in a row, we could see the Jays in this bottom row next week. Number 23. They made a case early in the week that they're going to start climbing this board. They sweep the New York Yankees, and at this point, New York fans are absolutely starting to freak. Other American League East fans are getting super excited that this is the blow-up time for the New York Yankees. But then Cincinnati goes in and plays a team that, after beating the Yankees, you would expect them to do well, and they get absolutely swept by the Detroit Tigers. Just comes back to me as a most inconsistent team in the MLB that is on the losing end of run differentials, of pitching, of batting all season long. So I like what I saw against the Yankees, but it is just one series, and I can't forget what I've seen so far with the Reds this season and with what we saw against Detroit over the weekend. I think we can't forget too quickly. Number 22, I do have the Pittsburgh Pirates, and they're at the similar boat as the Reds. At times you think they're super exciting. Paul Skeens is probably the one savior of this team this season. However, they are not winning series whatsoever, except when they seem to be playing the Reds. They lose to the Cardinals this week. They lose to the Mets this week. Both teams that are fighting for wild card spots, and teams that Pittsburgh's going to have to beat if they're going to get in there. And at this point, we're starting to see teams 22 and below really being the ones that are out of the playoff race. And they're struggling. They're drowning. It's All-Star break coming up. It's really that turning point. Are these teams going to be sellers? It's going to be interesting. Number 21, one of the younger teams on the board. They had such a good start to the year, but it's kind of faded. And I don't blame them. The division seems to have a couple of teams that are a little bit ahead of them. They go 1-2 against Minnesota earlier in the week. Nice sweep over the Reds, though. I do like what I'm seeing there. And pretty much being able to bounce back after a tough division loss. Nice sweep. Detroit is kind of hanging around. We do see them coming up with some important games in the division. And of course, anything can happen. Some of these teams, I'm talking about them being out of it, but when you look at the standings, look how many games back, they're really not out of it. Number 20, dropping a few spots, we do have the Washington Nationals. 2-2 against the Mets, 1-2 against the Cardinals. Don't know what else to say for the Nationals. It's just been rather interesting. We did see Wood make his debut for them I think it was this week, earlier against the Mets. I do believe it might have been on the weekend. However, he's been pretty big addition to this lineup, and the offense seems to be pumping for the Washington Nationals. But on the other hand, the pitching has just not matched it whatsoever, and the depth. And we see a lot of their guys in their later years in this rotation. Of course, they're just probably using them to fill up some innings this year. This team is still about growth. I do figure all these teams, these 4 here, are relatively about growth. Some of them are further along than others and just don't seem to be getting it together. I do expect maybe these 2 teams in the future, definitely Washington has a bright future ahead of them if their picks hit. Number 19, they had a pretty good week. Had to be somewhat excited. They did have a monster weekend sweeping the Tampa Bay Rays, which at the time was one of those teams that was hottest over the past 6 weeks or so. They had finally broken through 500. Texas having a little bit of a boost this week. They do see Max Scherzer come back. He had a pretty great outing. However, they did lose that game. They went 1-2 against the Padres earlier in the week. A little bit of a matchup of two teams that have aspirations of being playoffs. Padres are in, Texas on the verge. They want to get back into the game. They have a big hole to fill because they got kind of behind the eight ball before some of these injuries starting to come back. This was a good start. They were further down on the board. I have a little bit more faith in them. I'm not ready to move them up the board. However, the week leading up to the All-Star game, if they have a pretty good week, much similar to this week, I think I'd be ready to really get back on board. Number 18, we do have the San Francisco Giants. This is a team that just continues to be consistent. It was a 500 week. I feel like almost every week this is happening. And that's got to be a good sign to at least stay in the playoff race. 2-1. They went over the weekend, 2-1 against Atlanta. It was earlier in the week, a team that they're going to have to beat up, and they did it. And then they go 1-2 against against Cleveland. So that was actually a really good series. Watching the game today, actually, when they lose 5-4, was back and forth, and Cleveland has been a top row contender for a lot of the past month, 6 weeks even. So San Fran has shown that they have been super competitive in their division with the Dodgers, the Padres, and the Diamondbacks. They always are at least fighting in those series, and we see them pick up wins often. It's just at times we see them kind of stumble against the weaker teams. So it's like a 500 all the time kind of team. I do want to see them build off this series with Cleveland, how they do after losing such a tight-fought series. I want to see how that goes. I do think they are very capable of starting to move up this middling row here, and that is something that I did not believe because about a month ago, I had them at number 25, thinking that was going to be their new home, and they proved me wrong. Number 17, a little bit of a slowdown after the past few weeks on. Really, maybe you could argue these teams are quite similar. I do give Tampa Bay a little bit of the edge because it feels like they have been hot for a little bit longer. Had a nice series win against Kansas City Royals earlier in the week, and they kind of fell flat over the weekend, of course, against Texas, but it felt like a coming out party for Texas. So I wasn't too concerned about what I saw. There was a chance, I think it was Saturday, that Tampa Bay had to beat Texas, and it was a really close game, and then Texas, I think, won it in the bottom of the ninth, maybe the bottom of the eighth with that Semien home run. But Tampa, they've just been like competitive always, and always seem to find the next guy up, and it seems to be working. They're battling around 500. We talked about other teams in the past, like San Diego, who have been around 500. San Diego battled it for months. Let's see if Tampa is going to be in that same boat. Are they going to fall, or are they going to just break through and keep on rolling? Very capable, and they're a team that matches up in my books against almost every team on this board. Number 16, I think a little bit of coming back down to earth, but still a winning week for the Mets. 2-2 against Washington. It's not exactly what you wanted to see after being so hot against a team that is somewhat close to you in the playoff race, in the division race as well as maybe the rebuild race divisional rivals, but they did come out 2-2. Was a little iffy at times, but they managed. And then they go in and play Pittsburgh over the weekend and win that series. So I still have a little bit of faith in the Mets. I do think they are sorting it out. A little bit of a slowdown. I do start to clump this third row. It's really interesting. This is probably the tightest row on the board. Number 15, do you have the Arizona Diamondbacks? These guys are finally, it's like they've been 17, 18, 19, 20 in this area for like the entire season, and it feels like it's finally time they're going to start breaking out, and we might start to see the National League team that competed for the World Series last year. 2-1 against the Dodgers, 2-1 as well against their division rival, the Padres. Just a winning week against the two guys ahead of them in their division. Their pitching is starting to get there. They're starting to get healthy. They're starting to get a little bit going, and Arizona has got to be one of those teams to watch out for. When I made my playoff predictions, I think it was almost a month ago, I did predict them making the playoffs, and I don't know if a lot of people were in that boat, but now they're starting to show why I did have that support. I think if they can keep this up going into the All-Star break, have another winning week, we could see them starting to flirt with number 12 up here, which is the playoff category, because number 14 is another team that at times you were super excited about early in the season. They even had a chance in the top row at one point, but they just have slowed down, and this was a week that was just the same. 1-2 against Tampa, a team that you could possibly argue that Kansas City falls even farther down. They also go 1-2 against Colorado. I just wasn't ready to just drop them 10 spots because I think I had them 10th last week. we'll do 4, and if they have another slowish week, well, these other teams start continuing to play better, we'll see them drop even more. It's starting to get to that part of the board where if you don't start putting up W's, you're going to start falling. So that's kind of what's happening with Kansas City. The teams ahead of them, they're winning, they're not, and that's what's going on. Number 13, another team that has not been having a good time as of late, and they had their hands full with the AL East this week. They were at home. They had Baltimore and Toronto both at home, and they lose both those series 1-2. They pick up wins, no sweeps or anything, but the one concern for this team, of course, has been offense. The pitching, for the most part, has been relatively consistent. They probably have the best rotation going in the entire MLB, arguably. But Seattle is starting to slow down. We had that hot period back in May, early June. People were saying I had them too low. And then as I start peaking them, they start to fall apart and kind of back to where they've been. 13 seems really reasonable. They lose to teams below them, but they did have a monster division lead at one point, still there, but it's really, really small. And as you can tell, they are not the highest on the power rankings in that division. Number 12, we have the Cardinals. The Cardinals continue to be quiet, sneaky winners. And this week was no different for me. I kind of didn't follow them too closely this week. It probably has to do with who their opponents were, Pittsburgh, Washington, but they managed to win both those series and maintain a pretty steady pace in this wild card, if not the National League Central Division, right? So 2-1 against Washington, 2-1 against Pittsburgh, and just a little quiet winning week and a quiet little spot in the playoff race. I think of all the teams that are kind of battling here, St. Louis feels quiet to me. Maybe it's just where I am, but not a lot of people talking about St. Louis, and I think we should start. Number 11, you have the Houston Astros. They have been just steady as she goes, righting the ship, slow season start, but they're figuring it out, and it showed with Yordan Alvarez just absolutely demolishing the Blue Jays. I think he hit 3 home runs in the first 3 games, won each game. They go 3-1 against the Blue Jays on the road, and then they do play the Minnesota Twins on their way back. Twins, again, a team ahead of them. They go 1-2, and that was an epic series. Might have been the best series over the weekend to watch. Absolutely interesting. Could have went either way, but the Houston Astros do fall a little bit short. Number 10, to have the San Diego Padres, a 500 a week, 2-1 against Texas, 1-2 against Arizona, and after really breaking through 500, after flirting with it, battling it all season long, they got 6 or 7 games above, and now it's like, okay, another 500 week. What is the San Diego Padres team? It's really tough to figure out, but at the very least, they've been super consistent at 500. We haven't seen a lot of 10-game stretches where they're 3-7, 2-8. Doesn't really happen for this team for the most part. So I think when it comes to a long season like of baseball, that's super important. But of course, come playoff time, it's not going to be good enough to get you super deep. So I think 10 is a pretty good spot and kind of explains how San Diego's season is going. They got a little bit long way to go to catch the Dodgers in my books, and they got a hungry Diamondbacks team that is a little bit of a 10-game streak away, but they could very well do it, and they started by winning that series this weekend. Number 9, keeping them relatively the same, and a lot of it is just a 500 week, 1-2 against San Fran. They beat the Philadelphia Phillies over the weekend, which, to my surprise, happened. But they've been playing solid baseball, at least for the past couple of weeks after struggling for a few weeks before that. Atlanta, 500. It's not going to be the best record that you want when you got hungry teams behind you, but it's been at least enough to maintain them in this top 10 on the board. The start to the season they had is playing a big impact in where they're sitting in the standings. Chris Sale's having a Cy Young style season. There seem to have some other pitchers stepping up along the way, and it's like rejuvenation of Jared Kelenic there. The top of that lineup has just been absolutely crazy to see, actually, and it's been exciting. This team, on paper, they lose some of their stars, right? But they were a really deep team, and when you have a really deep team, losing one guy still puts you in a pretty good spot when you're playing half the guys in the bottom of this board. Number 8, moving on a couple of spots. If it wasn't for yesterday, they probably would have went up even more, but they got absolutely demolished by the Yankees yesterday. As you guys know, I do the filming of this video before the Sunday Nighter, so if you're in the comment section saying Boston won the series against the Yankees, how do you not have them ahead of the Yankees? Clearly, you're new to the channel. You don't know that I do this before the Sunday night game. The series right now is 1-1. So there is that. Boston got blown out yesterday. They did win the first game on Friday. The Yankees have had a tough week leading up until now, and Boston had an awesome week sweeping the Marlins. But that moved Boston from here up to here, whereas the Yankees have been top row for, I want to say months, but I think it's been the whole season. Number 7, speaking of which, so these two guys are neck and neck. Really, if I'm being honest with you, whoever wins this game is the true number 7. Whoever wins tonight in my books, that's going to be the switch. So keep that in mind. The Yankees struggling, and they fall out of this bottom row, or out of this top row, and it's tough to watch. This Yankees have been so good, and the Judge and the Soto and the guys at the top of the lineup have been so good, but the rest of it just seems like the wheels are falling off, and there are times where we see some plays being made that just are bad baseball plays that are costing the Yankees games. And you're starting to wonder, like, how can Boone keep this together at times? Is it just going to be another one of those seasons where they just have the wheels fall off and everything happens? Other times it wouldn't matter, but they do have the Baltimore Orioles in this division, and they're running away. They're not running away with it, but they're gonna run away with it if the Yankees don't sort it out. Number 6, Milwaukee Brewers 2-2 against Colorado, 1-2 against the Dodgers. So a sub 500 week of a team that had bolstered up to number 4, but it's been a tough week for a lot of the teams in this top row. But if you're losing to the other team that was below you, that you guys were super tight, you lose that series, you're going to lose the spot, and that's essentially what happened. Milwaukee still holding on to the division with relative strength. It's going pretty well. They do have the Cardinals who are sniffing at it. I still think Milwaukee has the super advantage, and at this point, I think they are a top row team. But you can't have losing weeks, especially when you're on a 4-game against the 30th team. You got to win that series. Number 5, highest they've been all season potentially. Don't know for sure because they might have been up this high at the very first week. I can't remember. But Detroit, they win that series 2-1 early in the week. They beat Houston, so just maintaining some solid wins, and the offense has been popping. This rotation's been keeping it steady. The ship is starting to be a steady forward. They've been so streaky. They've been super streaky early. They had some of the longest losing streaks. They had some of the longest winning streaks, but now it just seems like over the course of 10 games, they're 7-3, they're 6-4 constantly. So I think that is starting to be obvious that this team they're going to start fighting. The Guardians did build quite a big lead, but Minnesota is not afraid. There's lots of baseball to be played, and I am not putting it out of the possibility that they can close that gap. Number 4, at the LA Dodgers, 500 week for them, 1-2 against Arizona, 2-1 against Milwaukee. I guess I move them up a couple of spots here. Maybe I have them 5th. I can't exactly remember where they were last week. Really, it's just them moving up past Milwaukee. Other than that, it's been kind of steady as she goes. Nothing too much that stands out to the Dodgers this week. 500 week. It's not great. They have a hungry Minnesota team in my books that is right behind them. And even other teams that are fighting for the top row, Boston, if they can beat this series against the Yankees and then have an awesome 5-1 week next week, it's going to be really hard to look past that and keep them if any of these teams start to struggle. Number 3, I am putting the Cleveland Guardians 2-1 against the White Sox, 2-1 over the weekend against San Fran. And one of the teams I consider to be the strongest right now is San Fran. So a lot of credit goes into that. Guardians have a winning week. I like what I see after their tough series against Kansas City last week where they lost 3 of 4. A little bit of a hurting unit in there. We had a struggling Kansas City team in their division. I wanted to see them put them away, but they didn't necessarily do that. But they did have the kind of bounce back week I like to see. In my books, these top 3 are pretty solid. I don't know. Some people might have different top 3. I think the top 3 is pretty clear, and then it starts to get a little different. So Guardians and Dodgers have a little bit bigger gap than you would see in other areas of the board. So number 2, I do have the Philadelphia Phillies 2-1 against the Cubs, 1-2 against Atlanta. So another 500 week. The Phillies just haven't blown it away for me to stay. They were number 1 for I think the past 3 weeks, but they haven't done anything that really blew it out of the water for me that said, hey, these guys really need to stay up there. Whereas the new number 1 in my books has done that. We do have the Baltimore Orioles. I know I talked about it when I talked about the Oakland series, that they did get blown out yesterday, but to see them bounce back today with a big win, they win the series in Oakland, they win the other series that they played this week, 2-1 in Seattle. the West Coast road trip in the AL is never easy, and to have 2 winning series and to have this offense just absolutely be powering. Even when they gave up 17 runs or whatever it was yesterday, I think they scored 9 themselves. So the offense is by far clicking on all cylinders. A lot of concern maybe about the pitching, but I do expect the Orioles, they have the pieces to make some pretty drastic trades, I think. So anything that they're kind of struggling with, I think they are going to be able to bring in the pieces. So I'm not super worried right now, and they're building on the momentum. One team's struggling, the Yankees, and they are taking advantage of it, and you like to see that from a number 1 team. Just a little touch on the Phillies. I think they are up there. They're very competitive. We did see the Orioles beat them earlier in the season as well, so there is that little bit as well. I just think the Phillies have been a little bit not as wow as the Orioles have been as of late. But there you have it. Top 30 teams in the MLB, the power rankings that come out every week. And if you want to see them next week, make sure to hit that bell, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you for that next week. Let me know in the comments below, where do you agree with, where do you disagree with, and where am I just completely out to lunch. And guys, we will see you for that next video.